Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a prequel of a previous lesson. It can also be thought of as the introduction in a three-part trilogy, which is John's 6th chapter. And John's 6th chapter really explains 2 days in the lives of the 3-year remarkable ministry of the Messiah. So on day 1, the thing we're going to be covering today, verses 1 through 15, he feeds a crowd of 5,000 from a meager starting point for multiplication. And John's account records uniquely the sermon, so he explains the meaning of the miracle in a way that no other gospel author does. And every other, Matthew and Mark have the feeding of the 5,000 also come before the walking on water, which is also in John's account. We're not going to cover that today because it's not entirely relevant to the bread of life that this entire chapter is maybe the theme of. But Luke also records the Peter's confession as to who the Messiah was, which is found in Matthew 16. But the event is, as I said, just a day in the life. So by day, he did this miracle of feeding 5,000. By night, we find him walking on water and calming a storm. So this was really a remarkable man, and these are just 2 days in his life. So on the morning of day 1, we read, "After this, Joshua went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, that is Lake Kinnereth. So after this, now these 15 verses are, as far as I know, the first duplicate of any of the other gospels in John's in John's gospel. So 92% of the stuff you read in John's gospel, you're not going to find anywhere else. So in the first chapter, we read of his pre-existence and John the Baptist calling him the Lamb of Elohim, and the conversation between potential disciples, made disciples. In the second chapter, we read of the turning of the water into wine. We don't read that anywhere else, the transmutation. Then he clears out the temple towards the tail end of his second chapter, which the synoptic authors record at the 3rd year of his ministry. But John also mentions that he did it in the 1st year of his ministry. And then in the 3rd chapter, we read of the conversation with Nicodemus, the born-again explanation. Then in the 4th, we find him in Samaria, which no other gospel author records him in, and the harvest there, which laid the seed, which will be fully fertilized by the 8th chapter of Acts through Philip's evangelism. Then in the 5th, we find him in the temple, making blasphemous claims as far as his Jewish critics are concerned, and he appeals to the 3 witnesses, those being the Father, John the Baptist, and the Scriptures, which testify of them. So up until this far, we don't read of anything else. What we read in John, we don't read anywhere else. So the Sea of Galilee, he was a Galilean, which was to the north of Samaria, which was to the north of Judah, as the arrangement of the 1st century Palestine was. And Lake Kinnereth, I'm honestly not aware of where that is, but I know exactly, but I do know it's in the general territory of Galilee. And a large crowd was following him, because they saw his signs which he did on those who were sick. So this isn't the first time we read of miracles. The transmutation of the water into wine was the first miracle. Then he had, but we also read towards the tail end of that chapter that there were other miracles than the ones just described. So he healed a man's of palsy or something of the sort in the 5th chapter on the Sabbath day. So that miracles accompanied him wherever he went and testified to his claim of divinity and his messiahship. And he had attracted large gatherings because of it, because people had never seen anything like it. And Joshua went up on a mountain, and there he sat down with his disciples. So in the synoptic accounts, he generally has commissioned his disciples to cast out demons, heal the sick, preach the good news, teach, etc., etc. But he's mindful of their need for rest, so that's what he does for them there. But in John's account, we don't read much of the disciples, except in the 4th chapter when they went the long way around Samaria because they had to purchase food, and food was also the vacancy in this specific story, as we'll read. And the Passover was near, the festival of the Jews. The Passover commemorated their liberation from Egypt on the night where the firstborn children in the houses of Israel were passed over because they smeared lamb's blood on the door, and this was the 10th and final plague which struck Egypt, which finally compelled Pharaoh to let my people go. And it would have been of central spiritual and ceremonial significance, but this also establishes the tone of the sermon which comes after, of which we read. So this is an action sermon of sorts. The action and the verbs and the activity lays the foundations for the words in the two ones we've covered after this. Then Joshua, lifting up his eyes and seeing a large crowd coming toward him, said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for them to eat?" So the master never has the luxury of rest. He wants the disciples to rest, but his work is never finished. And when a crowd approaches you unexpectedly and unanticipatedly, we who minister are not to regard them as schedule hindrances, but the very reason and opportunity for ministry. And he's concerned for their physical welfare, and he asked the question to Philip, where should we buy bread for them to eat? As it turns out, the purchase is going to be unnecessary. He's going to make do with what they have, enough to feed this substantial crowd. And he said, trying him, for he himself knew what he would do. So he knew that it was a trick question. They wouldn't be purchasing bread. He knew in advance what the occasion was and what he would do to meet the occasion demands. He just wants to test and teach his disciples to see if they find the right answer. And as we see, the disciples can assess the problem, but only the Messiah can bring about the solution. Philip answered him, 200 pieces of silver worth of bread is not sufficient for them, for every one of them to receive a little. So he's mathematically minded. He's equating the provision of the demand, and he noticed that they don't have enough money because a silver piece would have been a day's wage in a worker of that time. So Philip, that would take them months to earn what they needed to feed the crowd, which then they wouldn't have the luxury of the time to do it anyway. One of his disciples, Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter, said to him, "Here is a little boy who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are these for so many?" So even though Andrew points to the solution, he's once more part of the problem. He's walking by sight, and he sees that there's this large crowd and this little itty-bitty bit of food that cannot possibly feed the substantial crowd. So he's evaluating the size of the demand and the diminishing vacancy in the supply for that demand. And Joshua said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, and the men numbering about 5,000 sat down. Now in other translations, and perhaps in other versions, we read that it was in fact more than 5,000 people, because it indicates and specifies that it was men and their families. So in Mark's account is one of them where we read that it was 5,000 heads of households. So it was really more than 5,000. It was close to 10,000, given the average father with 2 children, which no two situation would be exactly alike, but that's a conservative estimate of the crowd which had accumulated amongst him. And he is not a man who is moved or motivated by the size of the crowd. He does not have the mentality of the mega church celebrities, pastor, superstar, which is oriented towards growth and revenue. But we find him trimming the fat from the followers, so he doesn't want any fair weather disciples to sign up for what he has to offer them. What he has to offer them is a cross, so that doesn't appeal. But for people who walk by sight, they can see the food falling from the sky, they can fill their stomachs, and their physical needs are satisfied, but they lack the spiritual sight, walking by faith, to see what he really has to offer, and what he has to offer is more substantial than bread to meet the temporary occasion, but something eternal and significant, that being eternal life in heaven. And Joshua took the loaves, and having given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down, and the same with the fish, as much as they wanted. So from this paltry account, we read that they suddenly had as much as they wanted. So he not only met the need, but he accommodated the desire and demand. So they were full and satisfied. They did not... There was sufficient food to feed a crowd of 10,000 from what was leftovers of perhaps a single family or a single eater. So the moral of the story is, if you give all to Yahshua, no matter how small it is, and if he is your everything, he will make your little bit into everything. And that's a foolproof equation which ought to guide and govern the path of the disciple. And throughout our course of journey, there will be several occasions which demand that we give what we have, whether it's time, money, resources, energy. But if we give it our all, we can be assured that he will supply everything that we need. And when they were filled, he said to his disciples, "Gather the broken pieces that are left over, so that none gets wasted." So I also forgot to mention that he prefaces the giving, the distribution, and the multiplication with an expression of gratitude towards his heavenly Father, who he's in communion with and can work wonders because of that intimate connection. So gratitude ought always precede the eating of a meal. This is the case in the Last Supper, of which we read in all four Gospels. So thankfulness is key, because we cannot feed ourselves temporally or spiritually. Everything that we can eat, whether it's satisfying either element in our nature, belongs and is owned and controlled and created by him. But in the 12th verse, he has a mindfulness of resourcefulness, so he wants to conserve the food and not waste. So even though he just fed all this crowd, he's not of the mind to waste the gifts of the Father. He knows that those can come into use for some other person at some time later, sometime soon, in fact. So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with broken pieces of the 5 barley loaves which were left over by those who had eaten. So we read that they were left with even more than what they started. Here we read 12 baskets and 5 barley loaves. So, and they started with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. So they had more at the end of it all than they had to begin with. And that is why they should conserve, because from that little amount, so much came. How much more can come of this increased and greater amount? Then the men, having seen the sign that Yahshua did, said, "This is truly the prophet who is coming to the world." So they were convinced. They would have been vaguely familiar with the prophecies, the writings of the prophets. These would have been mostly uneducated men, but the Hebrews were literate. All of their children, about over 90% of them would have been literate and familiar in some sense, if even only secondhand, with the promises of the prophets. So every one of them would have been aware and waiting for the hope and expectation of the Messiah. And they realized that they hadn't had a prophet in some 400 years prior to John the Baptist. And Malachi, there's a distance of some 462 years. But they were aware that they were in the presence and the power of a prophet. And what did they do? Realizing how powerful he is. Then Yahshua, knowing that they were about to come and seize him, that they might make him king, withdrew him again to the mountains, alone by himself. So time and space is never an obstacle to the Messiah, even in pre-resurrected form. Often we read that Jews had picked up stones to throw at him, and before they could throw the stones they had picked up, he had vanished because his time had not come yet. So he's capable of getting away from it all. Of course, when it all comes to him, he embraces the opportunity to serve them. He did not ask for this crowd to cross the other side of the Galilee, which came to him for the sermon. But the tradition, they wanted to make him king because their conception of the Messiah was a liberator who would restore them to secular prominence along the lines of King David, one who would crush their oppressors and liberate them to the full extent of the Abrahamic promise, which stretched all the way to the Euphrates and to the south to the Egypt River. And now rulership in this cultural climate, the Romans were the rulers, and they had an operation of bread and circus to placate the masses. So it was more economical to feed them and entertain them than to fight them, imprison them, or kill them. So the link between the worldly mindedness between the Jews and the Romans are clearly embedded in there. But he gets away from it all. He withdraws again to the mountain. Solitude is a key component in our Christian walk, and the natural man is afraid of silence, especially in our day and age where humankind is conditioned to be entertained all the time. We have to hear music or something coming out of our smartphone. And yet we disciples must cultivate solitude in order to gain the silence through which we can may access a more intimate dialogue with the source of our prayers, who is able to feed us not only spiritually but temporally as well. But the spiritual feeding, which we regard to be the greater of the two, there's no expiration on it. It lasts for an eternity, and that's hopefully why you're here. And I'm glad you are, and stay tuned till next time. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.